Two peoples, one land, a conflict that has raged for generations, fueled by claims of ancestry, belonging, and blood. But what does the actual blood say? Not politics, not religion, not history books written by the winners. What does DNA, the one thing that cannot be spun, argued, or rewritten, actually reveal about who these two peoples really are and where they truly come from? For more than a century, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has been the site of one of the most bitter and enduring disputes in modern history. Jews and Palestinians have each built their identity, in part, on a claim to ancestral belonging. Jews point to thousands of years of scripture, exile, and longing for return. Palestinians point to generations upon generations of continuous presence on the same soil, in the same villages, tending the same groves of olive trees. Both narratives are deeply felt. Both are defended with passion. And for decades, they were treated as mutually exclusive, as if only one story could be true. Then science stepped in, quietly at first, and began asking a very different kind of question. Not whose story is right, but what does the genome actually say? Geneticists began collecting blood samples, then cheek swabs, then full genome sequences, from Jewish communities scattered across the globe and from Palestinian communities rooted in the land itself. They ran the data through statistical models designed to detect patterns invisible to the naked eye, patterns written in the twisting molecules inside every human cell. And what emerged, again and again, across multiple independent studies conducted by different research teams using different methods, was something far more complicated and far more human than either side's political narrative had prepared people to expect. The first major wave of this research came at the turn of the millennium, when a geneticist named Almut Nebel and her colleagues set out to examine the Y-chromosome, the piece of genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations. The Y-chromosome is a powerful tool for tracing paternal lineage because it mutates slowly and predictably, allowing scientists to reconstruct rough family trees stretching back thousands of years. Nebel's team analyzed genetic markers from more than 1,000 men representing nearly 30 different populations across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. When the results came in, they revealed something striking. Jewish populations formed a tight, distinct genetic cluster, but that cluster was not isolated. It sat interspersed with Palestinian and Syrian populations, closer to them than to European populations an ocean away. In other words, at the level of the Y-chromosome, Jewish men and Palestinian men were, broadly speaking, closer genetic relatives to each other than either group was to the populations of Warsaw, Berlin, or Paris. This finding alone was enough to unsettle assumptions on multiple sides. It challenged the notion, sometimes voiced in political rhetoric, that Jewish people returning to the region after centuries of diaspora had no biological connection to the ancient land, that they were essentially transplants from Europe with only a religious or cultural claim to belonging. The genetic data told a different story, one in which the deep paternal roots of many Jewish men traced backward through time to the same ancient Levantine populations that also gave rise to the Arabic-speaking communities living in the region today. But Nebel and her team did not stop there. A follow-up study in 2001 dug even deeper, and it uncovered something almost poetic in its symmetry. It found that Jewish populations were, in some genetic respects, slightly more closely related to groups further north and east, to Kurds, to Turks, to Armenians, than they were to their immediate Arab neighbors. At the very same time, the study found that Palestinians carried a notably high frequency of a particular genetic marker known as the J1 haplotype, a signature that may reflect migrations from the Arabian Peninsula sometime in the more distant past. So the picture that began to form was not one of two peoples who were genetically identical, nor one of two peoples who were genetically foreign to each other. It was a picture of two populations with deep, overlapping ancient roots in the same soil, roots that had grown, diverged, mixed, and grown again over thousands of years of migration, conquest, trade, and settlement. A few years later, a geneticist at Hebrew University named Ariella Oppenheim decided to push the investigation further, focusing specifically on the genetic relationship between Jewish men and Palestinian and Israeli Arab men. Her team examined the Y-chromosomes of over 100 Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish men, alongside more than 100 Israeli and Palestinian Arab men. The subjects were chosen carefully. Many of the Jewish participants descended from ancestors who had lived for centuries, scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, before returning to the land of Israel within the last few generations. Most of the Arab participants, by contrast, could trace their paternal ancestry to men who had lived continuously in the region for centuries, if not longer. What Oppenheim's team found was almost startling in its clarity. The Y-chromosomes of many of these men, despite belonging to people separated by religion, language, culture, and often bitter political conflict, clustered together into the very same small set of ancestral groups. Some of the genetic markers were so similar that researchers could trace them back to what appeared to be common paternal ancestors living in the region long before the modern religious and national divisions that define the conflict today. But a third of the distinct genetic lineages found among Palestinian men were rarely seen among Jewish men, reflecting the reality that these are not identical populations. But the overwhelming pattern, confirmed again and again, was one of deep genetic continuity and overlap, a shared paternal history stretching back long before Islam, before Christianity, before the destruction of the ancient temples, before even the earliest written records of the region's political history. Oppenheim and her collaborators described their relationship in terms that avoided political framing altogether. They suggested that the genetic proximity between these groups points to a shared history of related Middle Eastern ancestors, people who over the centuries chose different religious paths and different tribal or cultural affiliations, yet who nonetheless carried forward much of the same underlying genetic inheritance. It was not a story of one people displacing another, nor a story of two entirely separate peoples suddenly thrown together by modern politics. It was a story of common origin, followed by centuries of religious and cultural divergence layered on top of a shared biological foundation. As genetic technology advanced through the 2000s and into the 2010s, scientists moved beyond the Y-chromosome alone and began analyzing the entire genome, looking not just at paternal lineage, but at the full mosaic of ancestry inherited from both parents, stretching back through countless generations. One of the most significant studies of this new era came in 2010, when a team led by geneticist Doron Bahar published a sweeping genome-wide analysis in the prestigious journal Nature. Bahar and his colleagues examined genetic data from 14 different Jewish diaspora communities, including Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, Sephardic Jews with roots in Spain and the broader Mediterranean, and Mizrahi Jews whose ancestors never left the Middle East at all. They compared this Jewish genetic data against 69 non-Jewish populations spanning Europe, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. The results were remarkable. Despite centuries of separation, despite living in dramatically different countries under dramatically different circumstances, most of the Jewish samples formed a tight, coherent genetic subcluster. And when researchers traced the origins of that subcluster backward in time, it pointed unmistakably to the ancient Near East, to the very same region now home to millions of Palestinians. European genetic influence was clearly present in many Jewish populations, a legacy of centuries spent living among European host populations, intermarrying to varying degrees, and adapting to new environments. But that European layer sat on top of a deeper, older foundation rooted firmly in the Levant. The connection these Jewish communities carried to the ancient land was not simply a matter of religious text or cultural memory. It was, quite literally, encoded in their genome. At around the same time, researchers began examining a different piece of the genetic puzzle, mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively from mother to child, and offers a window into maternal ancestry in the same way the Y chromosome offers a window into paternal ancestry. Here, the story took an interesting turn. A study led by geneticist Marta Costa in 2013 found that a substantial portion of Ashkenazi Jewish maternal lineages traced back not to the Middle East, but to Europe itself. This finding suggested a fascinating historical pattern, one in which Jewish men migrating out of the ancient Levant during the long centuries of diaspora often married local, non-Jewish women in the lands where they eventually settled. Over generations, this created Jewish communities that carried a strong Near Eastern signal on the paternal side, inherited through the Y chromosome alongside a much more European signal on the maternal side, inherited through mitochondrial DNA. It was a genetic fingerprint of exile itself, a population that left one land, formed families with the people of a new land, and carried forward a blended inheritance for 2,000 years, all while maintaining religious and cultural continuity with the ancient homeland their ancestors had left behind. This pattern was confirmed and expanded in 2014, when a research team led by geneticist Shai Carmi at Hebrew University of Jerusalem sequenced the complete genomes, not just fragments, but the entire genetic code of over 100 people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. Their conclusion was striking in its simplicity. The Ashkenazi Jewish population, according to Carmi's analysis, represents an almost even mixture of European and Middle Eastern ancestry. Carmi himself described the likely historical mechanism behind this pattern as a sex-biased process, in which Middle Eastern Jewish men, arriving in new lands as merchants, refugees, or settlers, took wives from the local European population they encountered. Over dozens of generations, this process shaped the Ashkenazi Jewish genome into the balanced blend of ancestries that scientists observe today, a population that is neither purely Middle Eastern nor purely European, but something genuinely in between, a living record of a very specific and very long historical journey. Around this same period, a separate line of research using an entirely different genetic marker added further weight to the emerging picture. Instead of the Y-chromosome or mitochondrial DNA, this study looked at hundreds of autosomal microsatellite markers, small repeating segments of DNA scattered throughout the genome and inherited from both parents equally. Researchers analyzed these markers in dozens of individuals from 4 distinct Jewish communities and compared them against more than 300 individuals from a dozen non-Jewish Middle Eastern and European populations. The results showed that Jewish populations, despite their long separation across continents, displayed a high level of genetic similarity to one another, consistently clustering together in statistical models of population structure. But just as importantly, when placed on a broader genetic map alongside their neighbors, these Jewish populations landed in an intermediate position, genetically situated between Middle Eastern populations on one side and European populations on the other, a mathematical reflection of the very historical journey the other studies had already begun to describe. It was yet another independent line of evidence pointing toward the same fundamental conclusion: a Middle Eastern origin overlaid with centuries of European admixture. Researchers also turned their attention to a third group central to this genetic story: the Druze, a distinct religious and ethnic community concentrated in the mountains of Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. Studies comparing Druze populations to both Jewish and Palestinian populations found a striking proximity between all 3 groups, reinforcing the idea that the ancient population base of the Levant gave rise to multiple modern communities that later diverged along religious rather than strictly genetic lines. The Druze, much like Jews and Palestinians, appear to carry forward genetic threads from the same deep regional past, further undermining any simplistic narrative that treats these groups as genetically foreign to one another or to the land itself. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that this field of research has not been without controversy, and responsible scientists have never pretended otherwise. Genetic studies of Jewish and Palestinian populations touch one of the most emotionally charged subjects imaginable, and researchers on all sides have had to navigate accusations of bias, concerns about how their findings might be weaponized, and the ever-present risk that complex statistical results get flattened into simple, misleading sound bites once they reach the public. Some critics have questioned sample sizes, methodology, or the political leanings of particular research teams. Others have pointed out that early 20th century genetics was itself misused for racist and pseudoscientific purposes, a dark history that makes contemporary researchers understandably cautious about how their work might be received or distorted. Reputable geneticists in this field have consistently urged the public to treat genetic ancestry data as one piece of a much larger historical puzzle, not as a trump card that settles political disputes. Ancestry is not destiny, and shared DNA does not, by itself, dictate who has the right to govern a piece of land in the 21st century. Perhaps the most dramatic scientific breakthrough in this entire field came in 2020, when a team of researchers, led by Lyron Carmel at Hebrew University, working alongside the renowned geneticist David Reich at Harvard University, published a groundbreaking study in the journal Cell. Unlike previous studies, which relied on the DNA of people alive today, this research team extracted and analyzed ancient DNA directly from human skeletal remains, 73 individuals in total, unearthed from Canaanite burial sites scattered across the southern Levant and dating back to the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. This was, in effect, a genetic time machine, allowing scientists to peer directly into the ancestry of the people who lived in this land long before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam existed as organized religions, long before the modern nations of Israel and Palestine, long before recorded history had even begun to take the shape we now recognize. What the ancient DNA revealed reshaped scientific understanding of the region's deep past. The Canaanites, it turned out, were themselves not a single, uniform population, but a genetic blend, a mixture of earlier Neolithic farming communities who had lived in the region for millennia, combined with waves of migrants who arrived from the north and east over the following centuries, bringing genetic influences connected to populations from the Caucasus Mountains and the Zagros mountain range further east. And crucially, when the researchers compared this ancient Canaanite genetic signature to the genomes of modern populations living in the region today, both Jewish populations and Arabic-speaking populations, they found that this broad, ancient Near Eastern ancestral component likely accounts for more than half of the ancestry carried by many people in both groups today. The deep genetic roots of the ancient Canaanites, the people the Bible itself describes as inhabiting the land long before the arrival of the ancient Israelites, live on, quietly, invisibly, inside the cells of millions of Jews and Palestinians walking the streets of modern Jerusalem, Ramallah, Tel Aviv, and Gaza right now. This finding carries an almost staggering implication. It suggests that the ancient population of Canaan did not vanish or get replaced wholesale by later conquerors and settlers, as some historical narratives have implied. Instead, that ancient population's genetic legacy persisted, diluted and reshaped over time by successive waves of migration, conquest, and cultural change, but never erased. Both the Jewish people, whose historical and religious narrative describes their own ancient departure from and eventual dispersal out of this exact region, and the Palestinian people, whose historical narrative describes continuous, unbroken habitation of the same land across countless centuries, carry forward genetic threads connecting them to these same Bronze Age Canaanite populations. In a very real sense, the DNA suggests that both peoples are, at least in significant part, descendants of the same ancient population that once called this land home, before religion, before nationalism, before any of the labels we use today even existed. None of this means the two populations are genetically identical, and no serious geneticist has ever claimed that they are. Differences absolutely exist, and they matter for understanding the full picture. Ashkenazi Jews, as the research consistently shows, carry a substantial layer of European ancestry woven into their genome, a direct genetic consequence of centuries spent living, marrying, and building families across Europe. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities carry their own distinct genetic signatures, shaped by centuries in Spain, North Africa, Iraq, Iran, and elsewhere. Palestinian populations, meanwhile, carry genetic signals connected to migrations from the Arabian Peninsula, reflected in that distinctive J1 genetic marker found at high frequency among Palestinian men, a pattern not nearly as common among Jewish populations. Additional research has even identified subtle genetic contributions in some Levantine populations connected to historical migration and trade routes, stretching toward East Africa, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already intricate genetic story. Geneticist Harry Oster, whose research has spanned decades and included detailed analysis of 7 distinct Jewish populations from around the world, sampling more than 500,000 genetic variants from over 200 individuals, described these Jewish communities almost like an extended family, branches that separated from a common trunk long ago and grew in different directions, shaped by different environments, yet still fundamentally connected at the root. Karl Skorecki, another prominent researcher in this field who has spent years studying the genetic structure of the Jewish people, was once asked whether these genetic ties between Jews, Palestinians, Bedouins, and Druze populations carry any real significance in today's contentious political climate. His answer was thoughtful and, in many ways, quietly profound. He said it did not matter to him personally because he believes that a shared global human identity ultimately supersedes every other consideration that might divide us. That perspective captures something important about how the scientific community as a whole tends to approach this research. Geneticists studying this region are, for the most part, extremely careful to avoid using their findings as ammunition in political arguments. They understand, better than almost anyone, how easily genetic data can be misused, cherry-picked, or distorted to support one narrative over another. A shared genetic history between two populations does not, by itself, resolve questions of national sovereignty, of political rights, of who controls which piece of land today. Genetics can tell us where populations came from and how they are related to one another across the deep span of human history, but it cannot tell us how modern nations should be governed, where borders should be drawn, or which political claims deserve precedence in the present day. Those are questions for history, for law, for diplomacy, and ultimately for the people living in the region themselves to work through. And yet, even with all of these careful caveats in place, it is difficult to walk away from this body of research without feeling that something remarkable has been uncovered, something that transcends the daily headlines of conflict and division. Study after study, using different techniques, different sample populations, and different research teams working independently of one another across more than 2 decades, has arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. Jewish and Palestinian populations share deep ancient genetic roots in the very land both groups call home. Their family trees, traced back far enough, converge again and again in the ancient Near East, among populations that lived in this region long before any of the labels, religions, or nations that define the modern conflict ever existed. Consider what this actually means on a human level. Somewhere in the deep genealogical past, a Jewish man living in Tel Aviv today and a Palestinian man living in Ramallah today may well share common ancestors, real people who lived, worked, and raised families in this exact stretch of land thousands of years before either modern nation existed. The Bronze Age farmers of Canaan, the ancient inhabitants whose bones were unearthed and genetically sequenced in that landmark 2020 study, are not some distant, unrelated people. They are, quite plausibly, the ancestors of both. Their DNA persists, fragmented and reshaped by millennia of history, but present nonetheless in the cells of people on both sides of a border, both sides of a wall, both sides of a conflict that has cost so many lives and caused so much suffering. This is not a story that neatly serves either side's political talking points, and that is, in many ways, exactly why it matters. It does not prove that one people has a superior claim to the land over the other. If anything, it suggests the opposite, that the sharp absolute categories so often used in political rhetoric, the idea that one group are the true, original inhabitants, and the other are outsiders or usurpers, are far too simplistic to capture the genetic reality on the ground. The truth, as revealed by decades of careful, painstaking scientific research, is messier, more intertwined, and in some ways more hopeful than either extreme narrative allows for. Both peoples carry the genetic legacy of the same ancient land. Both peoples are, in a very real biological sense, children of the same deep and distant past. Science, of course, cannot end a conflict rooted in generations of political grievance, religious conviction, displacement, and loss. DNA sequences cannot rewrite history, cannot undo suffering, cannot draw new borders or negotiate peace agreements. The geneticists who have spent their careers studying this exact question are the first to acknowledge that their work, however illuminating, exists in a different realm from the political and historical disputes that dominate the headlines. But there is still something worth sitting with in these findings, something that goes beyond academic curiosity. In laboratories across Israel, across the United States, across Europe, scientists extracted DNA from Ashkenazi Jews whose grandparents survived the horrors of the 20th century in Eastern Europe, from Mizrahi Jews whose families never left the Middle East at all, from Palestinian families who have tended the same land for countless generations, and from 3,000-year-old skeletal remains buried in ancient Canaanite tombs. And when they compared all of that genetic material side by side, the deep underlying story that emerged was not one of two entirely separate peoples locked in an ancient, unbridgeable divide. It was a story of shared origin, of common ancestors, of two branches that grew from the very same ancient root, shaped over thousands of years by different choices, different migrations, different religions, and different histories, but never fully severed from one another at the level of blood and bone. Journalists who have covered this research over the years often describe a similar reaction from readers and viewers alike, a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and eventually a kind of cautious wonder. People raised on narratives of total separation, of two peoples with nothing in common but a shared piece of geography and a long list of grievances, often find it genuinely disorienting to learn that their closest genetic relatives, statistically speaking, might be sitting on the other side of a checkpoint or security wall. That discomfort is understandable. Identity is not built solely on genetics, and no one is suggesting that a shared genetic history should override the very real, very different lived experiences, cultures, languages, and religious traditions that make each of these communities distinct and valuable in their own right. But the discomfort is also, in its own way, productive. It forces a re-examination of assumptions that have hardened over decades of conflict, assumptions that treat the other side as fundamentally, irreducibly foreign. Perhaps that is the most powerful takeaway from all of this research, more powerful than any single statistic or study result. Long before the modern conflict began, long before flags were raised or borders drawn, long before anyone alive today was born, the ancestors of both Jews and Palestinians were, in many cases, one and the same people, living, farming, and building lives together in the same stretch of land between the river and the sea. The science does not tell us how to resolve the political questions that divide this region today, but it does offer a quiet, undeniable reminder that underneath the layers of history, religion, and politics that separate these two peoples now, there lies a shared genetic inheritance stretching back thousands of years, written not in ideology, but in DNA itself.